Welcome to Eldercare Illuminated, Torchlight's caregiving podcast. Eldercare Illuminated addresses the ins and outs and ups and downs of caring for your loved ones. Join us for interesting conversations with eldercare specialists, geriatric care managers, attorneys, and ordinary people with extraordinary caregiving experiences.
Hello, everyone. This episode of Eldercare Illuminated was recorded on February 28th, 2020, which seems like another lifetime, before the full emergence of the coronavirus pandemic turned our world topsy-turvy. The topic of today's conversation is grief, which is part of every human being's portion. You will not hear us talking about COVID-19 and the grief that we are all experiencing, having lost our normal routines and expectations for daily life. That is another conversation for another day. Today we are talking about death and grief, also completely relevant to current events. I hope you and your families are safe and well. So having said that, let's move on to today's podcast.
Welcome to a new episode of Eldercare Illuminated. I'm Lenore Tracey, your host, and the Eldercare Practice Leader at Torchlight. Today, I am delighted to welcome our guest, Amy Tucci, President and CEO of the Hospice Foundation of America, which educates professionals and the public about care at the end of life. Amy began work at the Hospice Foundation directing its program, Living with Grief. Welcome, Amy.
Thank you, Lenore. Great to be with you.
Amy, in my world, I think a lot about the stresses and strains of caring for another human being who is ill, has a disability, or is facing the end of life. Part of caregiving seems to necessarily involve loss, whether that is the loss of a person you loved, the loss of a relationship, or the loss of one's own understanding of the way their experience of caregiving will go, loss of expectations. I'd like to start with something easier in a conversation about death and dying, although much of it is not easy at all, by asking you to talk about grief in the context of your work in hospice. Where does grief fall in the spectrum of services or help that a typical hospice organization offers the family when a patient is dying?
Well, Lenore, that's one of the really special things about hospice providers. All Medicare certified hospices, and most hospices are Medicare certified, are required to make 13 months of grief support available to families of the deceased after the death. I think while not all families need bereavement support or want bereavement support, a number of families do take advantage of it. Hospices offer one-on-one counseling, support groups, education about grief and loss that is really helpful in someone's grief journey. In addition, many hospices are grief resources for the larger community. So a death doesn't necessarily have to occur in hospice for somebody to take advantage of hospice bereavement services. And many hospices offer grief support at no charge or ask for a small donation when people in the community who weren't necessarily served by hospice attend a grief support group. Hospice bereavement folks also do a lot of work out in the community with schools, employers, and others who may need counselors to help after a death in the community.
Unfortunately, we see that with some of the school situations, faith group situations. So that is great to know that your loved one or you don't have to have been a direct patient with hospice to avail yourself of some of the goodness that they offer.
That's right.
Many people, I'm going to talk about grief itself, many people may be familiar with the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross model of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. I remember I learned about that in college psychology classes. I understand that Kubler-Ross's theory is no longer the most widely accepted way that we think about grief and death and how those two things work. Are there other models that might be more helpful for a person who has lost a loved one to better understand the experience?
Yes, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross deserves a lot of credit for opening up the conversation in the United States and actually around much of the world about death and dying. But unfortunately, the 5 stages work that she did really applied to the experience of death, not to the experience of grief so much. And it has somehow morphed into an easy way to think about grief and loss. But all grief experts today believe that there are no stages when it comes to grief. And there are also no real rules about grief and how you would experience it. The biggest misconception I think that the Kubler-Ross stage theory does is it makes people think that grief is a linear experience, and we know that it's not. Grief can affect people physically, emotionally, cognitively, spiritually, behaviorally, and as a grief expert that Hospice Foundation of America has worked with many years, Dr. Kenneth Doka likes to say that the experience of grief is as individual as a snowflake, that everyone has their own grief journey. Some of the current theories that are widely respected now are the dual process model of grief and bereavement, which is the theory is from Strobe and Schutt, who are 2 grief experts from the Netherlands, who say that people oscillate in their grief, ebbing and flowing with grief and emotions. So you may feel deeply sad at one moment and be able to laugh at something the next, but that these emotions is sort of back and forth of being able to cope and feeling a despair about the loss. It starts off strong after a loss and then dissipates over time. And then there's Therese Rando, theory of the 6 R's of grief. It's not a stage theory, but it is 6 things that occur in the process of grief. And I hate to use the word process because process seems to imply that there's a beginning of grief and an end to grief, and that gets into another theory of continuing bonds. Most grief theorists today also believe in the continuing bonds, which is even after a loss, you will always have that bond with your loved one and it will be incorporated into your life. But going back to Therese Rando's 6 R's, it's recognize the loss, react to the separation, recollect and re-experience the deceased in the relationship, relinquish old attachments, readjust and reinvest. Reinvest in your life going forward. There's also Warden's task model, which has a series of tasks that need to be performed, but not in a linear fashion. And those tasks can be repeated or done out of sequence. So I would say the overwhelming idea with grief today is that there are things that occur in the process of grief, but they do not occur for everybody and they don't occur all at the same time.
That sounds very useful because when I look at the Kubler-Ross theory, if you apply it to grief, it would seem to me that a person could look at that and say, I'm doing this wrong, or I'm not progressing properly, or it would give you an opportunity to make things even more difficult than they already are. And I also think what a comforting thought, that continuing bonds theory.
Right.
I like that.
The continuing bonds theory is really important because we do incorporate, and to bring up another theory of meaning making, which is Dr. Robert Niemeyer has come up with, meaning making and continuing bonds together is so important because we make meaning of somebody's life, and making meaning of someone's life is in large part incorporating that person's life into your life as you move ahead. So grief is a complex experience, as most people who have experienced know. There are also 2 other important things about grief, I think. One is that most people are resilient in the face of loss. Research by George Bonanno has really pointed to that. And the other thing is that some people experience post-traumatic growth in the face of loss. So post-traumatic growth means just what it says, that people will go on to grow in ways that they may not have grown as a result of loss. And it doesn't mean that the loss is good. I don't mean to be implying that, but some people do use loss as a way to grow personally.
Well, that's very logical to me. And whatever the experience of grief is that person has, it's got to be in some ways, it's enriching. It changes you. And that is fertile ground for growth. My parents, just to tell you a little bit about two of my experiences with death. My parents died under very different circumstances. My father died at the age of 58. Unexpectedly in the recovery room after a scheduled surgery. And subsequently, many years later, my mother died after about 9 years with Alzheimer's disease at the age of 90. So obviously everybody experiences a loved one's death differently. But are there common ways in which the experience of grief changes when the death is expected compared to a sudden, unanticipated loss?
I think so. There are always exceptions, I would say. But, of course, in a situation like yours with your father, that unexpected death can really cause a shock and disbelief. I mean, it can really jar you. It can be confusing. There's no time to say goodbye. You didn't know you needed to say goodbye. In the aftermath of that death, I mean, you may find yourself thinking about things that you should have said, would have said, had you known that that person was not going to be here the next day. So, I think a sudden death can seem extremely unfair, and it can leave people feeling very vulnerable too, to what psychologists call your assumptive world, that you think that something should be some way and then suddenly it's not. It can be very disruptive to somebody's life. And I think that with a longer illness, there's loss. Of course, you are expecting it. You've been told to expect it. People know to expect it. And in a case of a long illness, there are losses that occur along the way. Maybe somebody you used to be able to go shopping with your mother, and as her disease progressed, you couldn't go shopping with her. I mean, these sort of little things that we think about being mundane, that once somebody gets sick, they're not mundane anymore. The things that you really cherish, that you didn't maybe realize how much you cherish them, or being able to share a meal together, or lots of little things that sort of set you up in a way to prepare you for the death. And that experience is called anticipatory grief, where you are going through a process of little losses along the way. But I also think that even after a long illness, there's something about, we often say in hospice, that even during a long illness, death always comes as a surprise for some reason. And I mean, I've experienced that. You sort of feel like, oh my goodness, how could this have happened? I knew that he or she was sick for a long time, but the death seemed sudden. And there's some thought by grief experts that while a sudden death may be termed traumatic loss, that even in cases where there is a long illness, that experience of loss can also be a traumatic experience. One, because you've watched the decline of somebody. Your life may have changed along the way as a caregiver. So there are elements of trauma that can enter that longer process of death and loss.
I think that makes complete sense, and not to be stating the obvious, but when you are with someone who has been ill for a long time and possibly dying for a long time, not actively dying, but you're experiencing these incremental losses and changes that you talked about. But the thing about death is that it's final, and that finality of it is very different from the incremental changes. And like I said, I'm stating the obvious, but just saying that, we don't experience a lot of things in our lives that have that kind of finality.
Oh, I think that's absolutely true.
One of the things that made me think about when you were talking about the differences in the traumatic death is you talked about regret. that you did not say certain things or do certain things when the person was alive. And in my experience, one of the profound changes that I experienced was in my encounters thereafter with other people in a situation where they had to make a decision. And I'm thinking specifically, I was at a trade show once, and the company I was with was hosting the trade show, and we had other companies in the booth. And one of the exhibitors got a call that his mother was suddenly very, very ill, and he was debating with himself, do I go? I'm in the middle of a trade show. I'm at work. I have things I have to do. And I just remember there was no question in my mind that I said, you go. Because you can't unmake that decision. Whether your mother dies or not is kind of irrelevant. But if she does and you didn't go, you live with that. You have that regret forever. So go. And to me, that was such a no-brainer where he was struggling with that.
Absolutely. I always say, don't wait to tell a loved one how you feel about them. Don't wait till it's too late to say it, because we can find ourselves in situations where would have, could have, should have lasting repercussions in a lot of people's lives.
The people we talk to in Eldercare Illuminated are working people, and I understand that pull between, well, I have to go to work, or I am at work, or I have an important meeting. But when it comes right down to it, it's work. And what's more important in your life? A caregiver's days are typically filled with doing. And you don't have a lot of time or mind space for the being part of life. Going to work every day, you're making sandwiches for your kids if you have kids, or you're helping someone fill out college applications, and you're taking care of an aging or ill loved one. In the immediate days following the death of somebody, there's still a lot of doing to be done. But what then? That is a really hard transition point, and I think it would be helpful for people to have some understanding of that transition from all the doing, whether it's the caring for the person or setting up the funeral or memorial service or whatever, and the then what.
Yeah, I think this is a really hard period of time for a lot of people where they've been so deeply engaged. I mean, their whole identity can become that of being a caregiver, and then to be without it really feels your life can not only feel empty due to the death of the person you've been caring for, but empty because you sort of suddenly find that you don't have anything to do. So I think people have to find meaning in their new role that may not be being a caregiver or being as much of a caregiver. And, you sort of have to ask yourself a series of questions in a serious way, like, who am I now that my loved one has died? And importantly, who are the people around me who can provide the most encouragement to me now as I sort of transition in life? I think having that community of supporters is important. Asking yourself how your hopes for the future have changed. One professor I know who has done a lot of work in the world of grief and loss says that one of the most important things for people to consider after caregiving has ended. This is Professor Bill Hoy at Baylor University. He says, what are 2 or 3 things that I would like to consider doing, or places I would like to consider going in the next year? So turning the conversation to you for a change is important. And that in and of itself can be a really hard transition, but it's worth paying attention to.
I think that probably is difficult for many people who have been so focused on keeping the wheels on the bus from falling off and caring for somebody else whose needs have been dominant. How often does grief turn into depression or turn into something inescapable or unending for people?
Well, what you're describing would really be complicated grief, acute grief, and the symptoms, I would say, around acute grief don't dissipate after. There's some debate about this, but, if they don't dissipate over a year, is pretty much the general time period we're talking about, then it would be time to seek help. So grief is, like I said early on, it's different for everyone. So it's going to be experienced in a different way. And it may be a period of this sort of the acute grief phase before you enter an integrated grief phase where grief becomes part of your life still, but you can function in your role as a parent or a worker or somebody in your community with a role. It's a problem if the phase of acute grief where you would have yearning and preoccupation with the person or difficulty accepting the loss, if that goes on too long, that really interferes with your ability to function. And that's what experts call complicated grief.
I think you've described a situation where the way to know if you really need help or somebody that you know who has experienced a loss may need help if their experience of grief is impinging on their ability to get up and face the day, go to work or manage their normal activities.
Right. If grief becomes incapacitating, that's one way to think of it. And it's important, though, I think, not to rush to judgment about it either. Some people, physicians, think that it's a 6-month. If you're sort of not doing all right after 6 months, then it's time to look for help. Some physicians believe it's a year, and some others would probably say it's longer than that. But I think the common thinking by experts in the field of complicated grief is a year. And estimates vary about, how many people have complicated grief or will experience complicated grief. And I think looking at the research, you can say about 10% of all grievers, so 1 in 10 grievers will experience complicated grief, which seems like a fairly large number, actually, when you consider the number of people who are grieving at any given time.
Yes, but, we've been talking about, or at least sort of implying that we're talking about the death of a parent or an older person, but some of those many people out there who are experiencing grief are experiencing the loss of a sibling or a child. And I am grateful that I have not experienced those two things, but I can't imagine that those experiencing that kind of grief has got to be more complicated and more traumatic and has a very different kind of meaning than when you lose a parent or a grandparent who, at some level, that's the natural order of things.
I think that's true if it's a very traumatic death. For example of a suicide, if you witnessed the suicide or you found the body or it was a very violent death. I'm not sure, as horrible as it is, the loss of a child or the loss of and unthinkable really as it is, the loss of a child and the loss of a sibling is not necessarily doesn't mean that you're going to have complicated grief. I think the ability to adapt to the loss is really key to whether you're going to experience complicated grief or not. And oftentimes in the situation where, it's been a sudden and very disturbing death, it can set people up for a complicated grief reaction. But that should be seen as different from depression. So complicated grief is not equivalent to depression.
Oh, that is a good point to understand. Thank you for clarifying that. I want to turn our focus in the time that we have left away from what we've been talking about and think a little bit more about the workplace. I noticed on the Hospice Foundation's website that there is a brochure available called Grief at Work, a guide for employees and managers. I'd really love to share that with our listeners. Going back to work has got to be one of the hardest things to face after a death. We will put that in the show notes so people can access that. What are your top 3 or 4 pieces of advice for the caregiver on his or her first day back to work?
I think the first day back, take a deep breath and know that it's not going to be the easiest day in the world, but that you can get through it. I think it's important to, it's really a two-way street. It's important for managers and HR people to be able to step in and assure the person who's coming back to work that the expectations are low. And I think that people who are returning to work should similarly have low expectations for themselves going back to work at first, and know that it could be rough and that you may need to get away and have a good cry, or that you may need to leave early that day, but don't be too hard on yourself. It's also nice to have, one person that you're close to at work who can kind of run interference for you, depending on the interaction that you want to have with people around you. And that person could, for instance, say, Sally is just not up to talking about things today, so, let's treat it as a normal day. Or Sally's happy to have you stop in, or just somebody who can sort of serve as your spokesperson is a nice thing to have.
That is absolutely great advice. When my dad died many years ago, I did have a person like that, and I got the news at work. It was in the days when we had telephones and offices, and I called her and I told her, she was further away from me, and I basically said, can you get me out of the building because I'm a mess? So that is fabulous advice to pick someone, and that made a big difference on that day for me.
It really is important. And, it's important for a coworker. I think for a caregiver who's returning to work, it can be especially difficult because, if you're a caregiver, you've been probably spending a lot of time away from work, and then you're grieving and you return to work. And while you might expect your coworkers to be sympathetic and compassionate, some coworkers, unfortunately, are going to be react more like, well, she's finally back, or he's finally back, and now I don't have to, pick up the slack. And that is, that's a hard experience when you're coming back into the workplace, if you've just experienced a loss.
I was going to ask you what we coworkers should never say or do when a colleague returns to work after losing somebody they love. And that sounds like the first thing. You don't need to dump a ton of work on them that first day or first week. Glad you're back. Here are all the reports that I was going to do, but now you're back, so you can do them.
Exactly.
Anything else that we should be careful?
Well, I think that a lot of coworkers, especially with somebody who may be having a tough time with a loss and may have trouble concentrating at work. And these are all natural things for somebody who's experienced loss to have, just trouble concentrating for the first few months, or doing things sort of, haphazardly, not intentionally, of course, but any kind of comment like, aren't you over it by now? Or you need to do your fair share, or it's time to move on. All of these are unhelpful comments that really disenfranchise someone's loss. And by that I mean, it doesn't give the experience of loss the respect that it deserves. And I think it's just important for coworkers to have that compassion and to be able to offer not just, let me know whatever I can do to help, but specific offers of help are so much better. For instance, let me do this report for you, or I'm running out to lunch. Let me bring you lunch, or would you like a cup of coffee? I'll be happy to bring it to you. Those are all wonderful things to do for a bereaved coworker, and also to find out gently if they want to talk about things, not to expect them to want to discuss their loss at work. Those are important things to realize and take stock in when someone comes back.
Those are good pieces of advice, and those two words, compassion being one of them, and being gentle with each other, can make a big difference in your coworker's life. And of course, managers have a potentially powerful role in setting the stage for when that person comes back to work.
Absolutely. I mean, managers can really model that behavior and the values of the workplace. Very important. I think there have been a lot of important strides made in workplace recognition of the impact that caregiving and grief and loss can have on employees, but there's still a long way to go.
Totally agreed. And that's the business that Torchlight is in. And when it comes right down to it, it's how do you treat the person that's in front of you? And we can all afford to remember that. I wish that we could talk longer, Amy, because there's just a lot to think about here as a person who has experienced loss, will experience loss in the future, because we all will, and will be with others who have been in that position. But we're about out of time. I want to thank you so much for visiting with us today.
I appreciate being with you today. And, anyone who needs information on grief and loss, we have a lot of resources on the Hospice Foundation of America website at hospicefoundation.org. So come visit if you need grief resources or information about hospice care, or give us a call or send us an email. We'll be happy to help out.
That is excellent. We will put a link to the Grief at Work brochure, which of course will get people to the website. And within the Torchlight platform, we'll have some links in some of our end of life and other caregiving articles. Listeners, please join us soon again for another episode of Torchlight's Eldercare Illuminated, and you be sure to take care of yourselves.
Thanks for listening to Eldercare Illuminated, a Torchlight caregiving podcast. Find other episodes of Eldercare Illuminated on iTunes, Spreaker, and Podcast Go. If you're interested in bringing Torchlight Elder or any of Torchlight's other caregiving products to your workplace, please contact info@torchlight.care. That's info@torchlight.care.